Imagine a woman who served her country in wartime, earned a master's degree, interviewed one of Hollywood's biggest stars as a working journalist, and then accidentally became one of the most recognizable faces on American television, all before being publicly stabbed in the back by the man she considered family. That's a remarkable life by any measure. But the part of Nancy Kulp's story that nobody talked about for decades wasn't the betrayal, and it wasn't the fame. It was what she finally said out loud in a private interview, years before she died, a confession so carefully guarded that the world wasn't allowed to hear it until she was already gone. In 1989, Nancy Kulp sat down with author Bose Hadley, who was writing a book about Hollywood's hidden history. Before a single word was spoken, both parties signed a legal agreement. What was said in that room would stay sealed until after Nancy had passed. She died in February of 1991. The book came out in 1993. And what readers found inside was the kind of candor that Hollywood had spent decades making impossible. Nancy confirmed, in her own words, that she was a gay woman, and had been her entire life. She didn't announce it with anger. She spoke the way someone does when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have finally decided they're too tired to hold it alone. The meaning was unmistakable. But here's what makes it land so hard. The confession didn't arrive as gossip or scandal. It came quietly, through a book, years after she was gone. And that quiet tells you everything about the life she had lived. To understand what Nancy was finally walking away from when she told that truth, you have to go back to the beginning. She was born on August 28, 1921, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Her father was a traveling salesman. Her mother taught school. The family moved constantly, chasing stability through the Great Depression, eventually landing in Florida in the mid-1930s. Nancy was sharp from the start. She enrolled at Florida State College for Women, then kept going, earning a master's degree in English and French from the University of Miami. When she graduated, she walked straight into journalism. By the early 1940s, she was writing features for the Miami Beach Tropic, profiling public figures, covering culture. One of her most talked-about pieces came from an interview she secured with Clark Gable, one of the most famous men in America, while he was in the middle of military training. The kind of access that required serious confidence and professional credibility. Nancy had both. But then the war changed everything. In 1944, with World War II grinding toward its most intense phase, Nancy paused her journalism career and enlisted in the United States Navy Reserve, joining waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. She trained in cryptography and military logistics, climbed the ranks, and was eventually commissioned as a lieutenant, handling classified intelligence work for the duration of her service. When she was discharged in 1946, she carried 2 medals, the American Campaign Medal and the National Defense Service Medal. She was 24 years old, a decorated veteran, a published journalist, a master's degree holder. And nobody in Hollywood would ever really talk about any of that. What they would talk about instead was a single afternoon when a director looked up and changed the course of her life with one sentence. Nancy didn't move to Hollywood to act. That part matters. She arrived in 1951 to work in public relations at 20th Century Fox. She was good at it. She understood media, she understood people, and she knew how to frame a story. But one afternoon, veteran director George Cukor passed through her part of the studio and stopped. He looked at Nancy, her bone structure, her low and distinctive voice, the way she carried herself, and told her directly that she was wasting her time behind the scenes. Within the year, she had her first film role. By 1954, she was appearing in films competing for Academy Awards, sharing the screen with Audrey Hepburn in Sabrina. Within 3 years of being discovered in a PR office, she was working alongside the biggest names in the industry. But something else had already happened in 1951 that would quietly shape the next decade of her life in a far more private way. On April 1st of that year, Nancy married a man named Charles Malcolm Jews. On the surface, it looked straightforward, a newly arrived actress, getting married. But researchers who later examined public records noticed the timing didn't add up. The legal divorce was recorded in 1953, yet financial and legal documents showed the two maintained a connection until as late as 1961. This kind of arrangement had a name in Hollywood at the time: a lavender marriage, a union entered into by gay men or women to present a socially acceptable front to the public and to the studios. The practice was widespread during the McCarthy era, when any deviation from conventional norms could end a career overnight. For Nancy Kulp, it bought her nearly a decade of professional safety, and a private life she had to keep entirely hidden. What she paid for that safety, quietly, over years, is something the camera never once captured. In 1962, CBS launched The Beverly Hillbillies, and Nancy was cast as Jane Hathaway, the prim, bespectacled, fiercely competent secretary to the bumbling banker Milburn Drysdale. The show became a cultural phenomenon almost immediately. Tens of millions of viewers. Top of the national ratings. At its peak, one of the most watched programs in the history of American television. Nancy's performance was sharp, consistent, and frequently the most grounded thing on screen. In 1967, she received an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actress. By any professional measure, she had arrived. But the way the show used her character is harder to look back on now. The Beverly Hillbillies built its comedy, again and again, around Jane Hathaway being physically unattractive and romantically unwanted. Her unrequited interest in Jethro Bodine was a running gag, set up specifically so audiences could laugh at the idea of a woman like her hoping for love. Several entertainment publications at the time openly called her the ugliest woman on television. Nancy absorbed all of it publicly and said very little. But privately, she wrote in her diary about what it felt like to have her entire identity reduced to a punchline. She noted that the writers seemed to have decided from the start that Jane Hathaway was only funny if she was miserable. The gap between who Nancy actually was, a military veteran, a trained journalist, a multilingual scholar, and the caricature the show asked her to inhabit was enormous. And the show made sure the audience never noticed. When CBS cancelled the series in 1971, what came next was worse than the cancellation itself. Directors across Hollywood refused to consider her for dramatic roles. The reasoning, stated plainly in some cases, was that her face had become too deeply associated with comedic eccentricity to be believable in anything else. Typecasting used as a permanent door. She was locked out, and the key had been thrown away by the very success that was supposed to define her. But Nancy Kulp didn't retreat. She redirected. And what she did next almost nobody saw coming. She had spent years quietly involved in Democratic Party work in Pennsylvania, serving as a consultant without seeking attention for it. By the early 1980s, she had built enough of a local foundation that a congressional run felt like a real possibility. In 1984, she made it official, announcing her candidacy for the United States House of Representatives in Pennsylvania's 9th Congressional District. The district was a tough draw. Mostly rural, deeply conservative, with a Republican incumbent who had held the seat for 12 consecutive years. And layered on top of all of that, it was a presidential election year, Ronald Reagan on the ballot, a conservative wave sweeping across the country. Nancy ran anyway. She bought a motorhome and drove herself through dozens of small towns, stopping at community halls, diners, and front porches. She leaned on her name recognition not as a celebrity stunt, but as a way to get in the door with voters who might otherwise wave her off. Once she had their attention, she made her case on substance. And it was working. Schuster's campaign noticed. And then Buddy Ebsen made a phone call. Ebsen had played Jed Clampett, the patriarch, the man the audience trusted most. Off-screen, he and Nancy had worked alongside each other for 9 years. By 1984, he was also a committed conservative with close ties to the Reagan administration. Schuster's campaign recruited him. Ebsen recorded a 60-second radio advertisement that ran on stations across the district in the final stretch of the race. He told voters Nancy was too liberal, too progressive, and not equipped to represent them in Congress. He said he liked her personally, and then used that framing to make the attack land harder. Coming from someone who had shared a set with her for nearly a decade, someone voters associated with trustworthiness and folksiness, the message hit exactly where it was designed to. On Election Day, Bud Schuster won with more than 65% of the vote. In the days after the loss, Nancy spoke to reporters and didn't soften it. She called it a betrayal, cruel, deliberate, and something she had not seen coming from someone she considered family. Their relationship, which had survived 9 years on a television set, did not survive the radio ad. The political defeat broke something in Nancy that the Hollywood typecasting hadn't quite reached. Getting shut out of roles was professional. What Ebsen did was personal, and it happened in public, in front of the voters she had spent months trying to win over. She stepped back from public life. She took a position teaching art at a university level, contributed to charitable work, and largely stayed out of the spotlight. But the years between the campaign loss and her death were not empty ones. They were the years in which she finally made peace with the parts of herself she had been managing in secret for her entire adult life. The interview with Hadley in 1989 was part of that. So was the decision to seal it until after she was gone. She wasn't trying to make a statement from beyond the grave. She was trying to tell the truth without having to live through the consequences in real time, which, for a woman of her generation, was a completely reasonable calculation. In 1990, she was diagnosed with malignant lymphoma. She moved to Palm Desert, California, to receive treatment and to step away from everything that wasn't essential. When word reached Buddy Ebsen that she was dying, something shifted in him. He wrote her a letter, handwritten, sent directly to her, expressing regret for what he had done in 1984. It was a private apology. No press release. No credit seeking. Nancy received it and responded through a close associate. She was ready to let it go. She had reached the point where carrying the resentment was simply not worth the energy it required. She chose to forgive him, not because what he did was acceptable, but because she had more important things to spend her final months on. She died on February 3, 1991, at the home of a close friend in Palm Springs. She was 69 years old. Her body was returned to Pennsylvania and buried in Mifflintown, the small town where her family had once stopped during their Depression-era travels. The obituaries focused mostly on the Beverly Hillbillies. Very few tributes mention the Navy service, the journalism career, the congressional run, or the interview sitting in a publisher's archive waiting to be released. When the book came out in 1994, it found a specific readership: scholars of LGBTQ history, fans who had always sensed there was more to Nancy than the show ever let her express. But it didn't reach the mainstream the way her story deserved to. What has changed in the decades since is the lens through which people now look at Jane Hathaway. The character that 1960s audiences were supposed to laugh at, the angular, brilliant, romantically invisible woman who kept everything running while being treated as a joke, reads very differently now. The comedy hasn't aged well, but the performance underneath the comedy has. Nancy Kulp was playing someone who had learned to make herself useful and unobtrusive in a world that wasn't designed for her. And she was doing it with the kind of precision that only comes from genuinely understanding what that feels like. The confession she recorded in 1989 was her version of a final chapter, written quietly, released posthumously, on a timeline she controlled. For a woman who spent most of her career having very little control over how the world saw her, that might have been the most powerful thing she ever did.